See,
Because, hold on, stop.
No, hold on a second. This is
you
because you just
interrupt
want-
way too much.
No.
You need to stop.
When you think of Joe Rogan, you probably imagine endless conversations, wild theories, and debates that go off the rails in ways no one could predict. But here's the thing, not every guest leaves him impressed. In fact, over the years, a handful of people have sat across from Rogan and left him visibly frustrated, annoyed, or downright checked out. And recently, Rogan himself dropped a bombshell. He finally revealed the guest he hated most. But that's just the start. Because while Rogan named one, fans and critics have pointed to others, some that might shock you, some that make perfect sense, and others that leave you wondering how they ever made it onto the show at all. From heated arguments to awkward silences and explosive accusations, these 5 appearances stand out as the ones that Rogan and his audience just couldn't stand. So, who made the list? Who crossed the line from controversial to unbearable? And why did these particular names leave Rogan and millions of listeners wishing the episode had never happened? Out of all the wild and unpredictable characters Joe Rogan has invited onto his podcast, you might expect his worst guest ever to be some fringe conspiracy theorist, an aggressive debater, or maybe even a controversial celebrity. But no, when Rogan finally admitted who left the worst impression, he dropped a name nobody saw coming, Dr. Zahi Hawass, Egypt's former Minister of Antiquities. On paper, Hawass should have been a dream guest. He's a world-renowned Egyptologist, a man who spent decades digging into the mysteries of the pyramids, ancient tombs, and lost civilizations. You'd think Rogan would eat that up, right? Instead, it was the complete opposite. Rogan later admitted he couldn't stand the conversation, calling Hawass the worst guest he'd ever had on the show. Why? Because instead of sparking curiosity, the entire exchange felt stiff, dismissive, and downright condescending. Rogan even described how Hawass seemed annoyed by his questions, brushing them off as if Rogan, and by extension, the audience, weren't worth his time. What was supposed to be a journey into history turned into a frustrating back and forth where every attempt at curiosity hit a wall. And for a podcast built on long, open-ended conversations, that's a death sentence. It shocked fans because Rogan doesn't usually call people out like this. He's hosted flat, awkward, or controversial guests before without labeling them the worst. But with Hawass, the irritation was so obvious that even Rogan couldn't hold back later on. And that honesty, it sent fans scrambling back to rewatch the episode, trying to catch every uncomfortable pause and eye roll they'd missed the first time. But Hawass wasn't the only one who left people talking. Because while Rogan singled him out, there are a few other names that fans have crowned as the most hated in JRE history, and some of them might surprise you even more. If Dr. Zahi Hawass was the guest Rogan himself couldn't stand, the internet had its own list, and it was brutal. Big names like Twitter's former CEO Jack Dorsey, Hollywood actor Mel Gibson, comedian Eliza Schlesinger, and even political firebrand Steven Crowder all made the cut. On the surface, they're high-profile bookings, exactly the kind of guests most podcasters would dream about. But when they sat across from Rogan, the magic just wasn't there. Take Jack Dorsey, for example. As the man running Twitter at the time, people expected fireworks, hard questions about censorship, tech monopolies, and free speech. Instead, what they got felt watered down, with Dorsey dodging Rogan's tougher questions. Listeners accused the episode of being toothless, with Rogan going too easy on him. The disappointment turned into outrage, and Dorsey's appearance has been living in infamy ever since. Then there's Eliza Schlesinger, a stand-up comic whose episode was supposed to be light and funny. Instead, fans accused her of being combative and dismissive of Rogan's audience. What should have been an easy, comedic episode turned awkward fast. Many listeners dropped out halfway through, calling it painful and condescending. And let's not forget Mel Gibson. A Hollywood star with more than enough controversy behind him, Gibson came on to talk about health treatments and longevity. Instead of an engaging conversation, it turned into a strange sales pitch where fans felt Rogan was letting him ramble unchecked. The episode felt less like a podcast and more like an infomercial, and audiences weren't impressed. These names became the usual suspects whenever fans discussed hated guests. Not necessarily because Rogan despised them, but because the audience felt cheated. Big names raised expectations, but when those expectations weren't met, the backlash hit twice as hard. And if you think that was bad, wait until you hear about the guest that Reddit fans crowned the absolute worst. Their pick wasn't just dull, it was chilling. If Rogan's personal choice for worst guest was surprising, the internet's pick was downright haunting. Scroll through Reddit threads about the Joe Rogan experience, and one name keeps coming up again and again: Nick Yaris. For those who don't know, Yaris was once on death row, claiming he was wrongfully convicted, later freed after DNA evidence cleared him. On paper, that sounds like the kind of redemption story that would make for a fascinating, heartfelt episode. But for many listeners, the reality was anything but inspiring. From the moment the episode aired, fans were unsettled. Yaris spoke with the passion of a man who had been through hell, but his delivery struck many as theatrical, overblown, and, according to some, completely unbelievable. On Reddit, one commenter flat out called him a pathological liar, saying his story sounded like a phony sob story, more suited for a movie script than a podcast. Another listener chimed in, writing, "That one was crazy. Who the hell convinced Joe to bring him on?" The problem wasn't just the content, it was the credibility. People didn't know whether to feel sympathy or suspicion. Instead of sparking empathy, Yaris's appearance turned into a debate about truth versus performance. Was he a victim of injustice telling his story? Or was he a skilled manipulator who knew how to spin a crowd? The uncertainty left a bad taste in the mouths of many longtime fans. And for Rogan's podcast, which thrives on authenticity, even in the most bizarre, offbeat conversations, that sense of fakeness was poison. It wasn't just that people disliked the guest, they actively felt duped. And that kind of betrayal sticks. Years later, the Nick Yaris episode is still dragged into discussions about the worst guests in JRE history, a stain that never really washed away. But Yaris wasn't alone in stirring up controversy, because as bad as he was for some listeners, there's a difference between being hated for sounding fake and being hated for simply wasting people's time. And that contrast brings us to another category of Rogan's most loathed guests, those who weren't outrageous, just painfully disappointing. When people talk about Rogan's worst guests, it's easy to lump them all together. But there's actually a big difference in why they're disliked. Some guests are hated because they're controversial. Their ideas are offensive, their stories unbelievable, or their personalities abrasive. Others, though, are hated for a completely different reason. They're just boring. And on a show where every episode can stretch for 3 hours, being dull can be the ultimate sin. Take Nick Yaris as an example of the controversial kind. His episode sparked anger, disbelief, and outright hostility from fans who didn't trust a word he said. Love it or hate it, the controversy kept people talking. Now compare that to someone like Jack Dorsey or Eliza Schlesinger. They weren't despised for being outrageous. They were despised for being forgettable. The audience expected fiery debates, wild stories, or at least a bit of humor. Instead, they got polite dodging, awkward exchanges, or dismissive comments. It wasn't offensive, it was disappointing. This is where Rogan's podcast becomes tricky. A controversial guest, as messy as it feels, still creates buzz. People share clips, argue in comment sections, and keep the conversation alive long after the episode ends. A boring guest, on the other hand, kills momentum. Fans tune out, episodes drop in replay value, and the show loses the one thing Rogan values most: engagement. That's why some of the names on the most hated list seem so random. It's not always about politics, drama, or scandals. Sometimes it's about chemistry, or the lack of it. Rogan thrives when guests challenge him, make him laugh, or push him into unexpected directions. When none of that happens, the silence feels louder than any argument. Take Steven Crowder, for instance. A political commentator known for his sharp tongue and controversial takes, Crowder walked into the JRE studio with expectations already stacked against him. Fans braced for fireworks, but what they got felt more like chaos without direction. The conversation jumped from heated politics to awkward silence, and listeners accused the episode of being a train wreck Rogan never should have entertained. Instead of sparking meaningful debate, it felt like watching two people argue at a bar, loud, messy, and ultimately unfulfilling. Then there's Milo Yiannopoulos, another figure whose appearance left audiences polarized. Some tuned in out of curiosity, but many called it a platforming disaster, accusing Rogan of giving oxygen to someone they felt had nothing new or valuable to add. The backlash wasn't just about what Milo said, but about Rogan's choice to host him at all. The sentiment was simple. Why waste hours on this? These speculative picks highlight something bigger. On a show where literally anyone can show up, the audience expects Rogan to use that freedom wisely. When he does, the result is magic. Viral clips, unforgettable debates, legendary episodes. But when the booking feels off, the reaction is swift and unforgiving. And those misfires only fuel the discussion further, with fans dissecting Rogan's choices as if each guest is a puzzle to solve. So, what do we learn from all this? That on the Joe Rogan Experience, hate takes many shapes. Sometimes it's a guest who rubs Rogan the wrong way, like Dr. Zahi Hawass. Sometimes it's a guest who leaves fans furious, like Nick Yaris. And other times, it's someone who simply bores the audience into tuning out. Different flavors, same outcome. Those names get burned into the JRE history books, not for what they added, but for what they lacked. But here's the irony. Those hated episodes are just as important as the beloved ones. Because controversy, disappointment, even frustration, they all fuel conversation. Fans argue online, rewatch clips to spot awkward moments, and dissect every silence or eye roll. In other words, the very guests people claim to hate are the same ones who keep the podcast impossible to ignore. That's the genius, and maybe the curse, of Rogan's show. The freedom to book anyone means you sometimes strike gold and sometimes you crash and burn. Yet both outcomes matter. Both create stories people can't stop talking about. And in the end, isn't that what makes Rogan the most watched podcaster alive? So the next time you see a headline about Joe Rogan's worst guest ever, remember, it's not just about who he hated. It's about why we can't stop listening to the ones who drive us crazy. Because whether you love them or despise them, those episodes prove one thing: the Joe Rogan Experience is never, ever boring.